Previously on the Seventh Valkyrie, Strena notices something very interesting entering Rene. But with the rising tensions between old and new city, it's impossible to go searching for it. In person, that is. See what tricks this young gifted girl has up her sleeve, next on the Seventh Valkyrie. Chapter 17. A Twinkle in the Sky. Strena, the 11th day of winter, at dawn. Strena woke up early that morning to the very clear sounds of two men of shadows chatting as they finished up their night shift. They spoke in hushed voices as they guarded the front door on the other side of the haven, but Strena could hear them as clearly as if she'd been sitting right next to them. Moments of strong sensing were not new to Strena, especially not in the quiet times between waking in slumber, and doubly so at dawn or dusk. When she'd been younger, Strena had just called them real dreams, but Nisa, the wild woman, had taught her to understand those moments and even induce them intentionally. At the same time, though, Nisa had warned Strena to be very careful of testing the limits of her sensing anywhere in the old city, especially anywhere outside the haven. If the men of shadows were around, that could be trouble, because some people, Nisa informed her, could tell that they were being listened to and did not like that at all. Now, normally, Strena followed those warnings, but a few days prior, the children had been told that in the evenings they would have some guests staying with them. Calling them guests was just to prevent the very young children from being scared, as any of the older children knew how to pick out the men of shadows simply by their manner of acting and speaking, not to mention their distinctive tattoos, jewelry, similar dress, and often very powerful gifts. And that presented a quandary to Strena. Like many children her age, she was ruthlessly curious and often found it hard to ignore when the moments of strong sensing came. And she was in the haven, after all. But listening to the men of shadows when they were not expecting it could get her in a lot of trouble. It was troubling. This wasn't to say that the men of shadows themselves were feared by the children of the haven. More often, the men by the doors were friendly in sort of a crude, rough way. And the person talking that morning that Strena could hear was Ravi, a man of Teruvian descent who had been kind and talkative to Strena the few times they'd crossed paths. She didn't recognize the other voice. Ravi called him Slake a few times, but that was a word that some of the Firewaker men of shadows used to mean friend or brother, so it didn't really clarify who he was actually speaking with. And that mystery meant that eventually curiosity won out. Reasoning to herself that the men were talking quietly out of courtesy, not secrecy, and knowing that she could always pretend it had been an accident, Strena settled into her sensing slumber and listened in. The two men of shadows were talking about girls, it seemed. The few men of shadows Strena had encountered always seemed to be talking about girls, though when it came to how they spoke about girls, they always used some third language of phrases and terms that even Nisa wouldn't explain to her just yet. She'd tried to ask some of the boys what the phrases were supposed to mean, but they'd either run away or turned as red as the Firewaker's flames. And then when she'd asked Mama Maven, she'd gotten in big trouble and had to chew on flake leaf like she'd said a bad word, or 20. Strena didn't like the idea that there were adult things that she wasn't allowed to know about, especially when she could sense them if she tried hard enough. Most of the things that confused her came from the city in the dead of night, but when Strena asked, she always got the same answer. Well, we'll tell you when you're older. Well, we'll tell you when you're older. Strena certainly felt old enough, and it seemed like a waste of time to have all these things going on that nobody talked about except for the men of shadows. For a little while longer, Strena listened with academic intensity, trying to decipher the strange, hidden language, but she found little progress. And by the time that first light hit and began to wake the other children, the men had finished their shift and headed off into the city. Filing the adult language away as something to revisit, Strena rose from her bed ahead of the rest of the children, got dressed, and went to the closet to get wrapped up in her warm winter coat. It was an old, worn-down thing that was large enough to nearly swallow Strena up, but it did the job of keeping her warm, which she'd need today. With confidence in her step, she slipped out of the door into the hallway, heading downstairs to the dining hall, where Garvey was stirring a massive pot of morning porridge. Breakfast had never been particularly exciting in the Haven. So, if Strena had heard, she'd never known anything else. But in the past few days, it had been an unbroken streak of just porridge, which seemed like it was going to continue as the days went on. Through her listening, Strena had realized that was from one of the adult things, but Mama Maven hadn't been inclined to explain, despite the fact that it was clearly obvious, both to Strena and to the other children, that something had changed. Still, porridge was one of Strena's favorites, and she made her way to the counter and jumped up, hanging on the counter with her feet a few inches off the ground. "Good morning, Strena," Garvey said, peeking up over at the young girl hanging from his counter. "Up early, aren't we?" "I'm excited to see Miss Nisa," she said. And Gooba was starting to get a little bit loud, and I didn't want to wake anybody up because of him. People get a little upset with Gooba when he starts going blah, blah, blah. Garvey laughed and continued stirring the big pot of porridge, then headed out to the back to retrieve another armful of logs and fill the big stone stove. In time, the crackling fire sparked up again, and Strena could see the steam rising from the pot. Her stomach grumbled loudly, and when Garvey turned with a raised eyebrow, Strena dropped off of the counter out of sight. "Oh, that's weird. I didn't know the wolves were so close this time of year," Garvey said. It sounded like they were growling just outside, practically on this counter. Can you sense them, Strena? I could never sense great." Strena called out from below the countertop. Yep. They must be big and hungry. I hope Miss Nisa will be okay." Garvey chuckled again, and there was a sound of a bowl sliding across the counter. "Well, you'll be needing your strength to make that journey today. Here, I added a little extra. I know how much energy a gift can take out of you." Strena stood up on her tiptoes and grabbed the bowl, and then happily returned to the table to play with Gooba and devour the porridge. She actually ate 3 full bowls before the first of the other children started to trickle down, and then Mama Maven shepherded in the stragglers who didn't want to wake up, just as Strena was on her 4th, which she figured would be her last. There were other gifted children in the Haven, 3 others in fact, but 2 of them, Anna and Jorah, were still so young that they hadn't really awakened their full talents yet. Carmore was the 3rd, a Wind Waker, and while he was talented, he didn't like Strena, which Nisa said was because Strena was stronger than him, and a lot of times boys didn't like it when you were stronger than them. That was another thing that Strena didn't really get, and Nisa had agreed, explaining that people were the most complicated animals, and as a general rule were very hard to understand. But they were going to get to spend time with the animals today. After Strena finished eating, she cleaned her dish, checked in with Mama Maven, and wrapped Gooba up in her arms, before heading out to one of the benches outside. The air was fresh and crisp, but even over on the benches, she could still feel the smoky, smoldering energy of the Men of Shadows. Or at least, the one of them who had been a fire waker. Less pleasant was the skunky smell of some of the different leaves that Men of Shadows had been smoking. Breathing in smoke seemed like a bad idea to Strena. Whenever it happened on barbecue nights, she ended up coughing. But she'd also been cut off when she'd gone to ask what was so nice about that particular smoke. Mama Maven had scooped her up and told Strena that the men were doing yet another adult thing, like drinking those fiery drinks that adults sometimes had while they were here. "I'm ready to learn adult stuff. I'm almost an adult," Strena said defiantly to no one. According to any measurement, she was not. In the Haven, you were considered a child and could stay until you were 16. Strena was not yet 11. In the Old City, it was the same as in the Haven, so she would be a child there too. Even the wild women only considered you an adult once you were both mentally and physically ready to find a mate, which again was another thing that Nisa had brushed off as something Strena would understand when the time was right. This was an infuriating list that only continued to grow larger. Sitting back against the bench, Strena let Gooba bounce around freely, cozily wrapping up in the comfort of her coat. There were a lot of things to wait for. Nisa, being an adult, the Winter Festival. But This was as good a place as any to do some waiting. Kicking her legs from the bench, Strena watched Guba lunge and roll in his awkward manner around the dew-covered grass. He was searching for insects and worms, which Strena guessed were the only things even lazier than Guba was. Or maybe were in the mood to be eaten, that wasn't clear. But Guba's clumsy hunt came to a stop as he fell over, crying, "Ah!" Then made his way back to his feet with great effort and launched towards Strena with an emphatic roll, bouncing twice before sliding to a stop, upside down, wedged between Strena's legs. Strena squeezed him between her legs and lifted him up until he was safe in her arms, stroking the nearly spherical bird as she looked out towards the woods. For Guba, that had been a frantic sprint at top speed. And as Strena looked out, she saw, on the edge of the woods, snout to the air, a regal, ruddy and silver breezefoot fox. Strena stroked Guba and held him tight as the fox finished his survey of the clearing beyond the tree line, and then flowed across the uneven ground from ridge to rock to riverbed. Each time, it raised its nose again briefly to sample the scents, before continuing its graceful descent towards where Strena sat. Despite Strena's tight hold on him, Guba continued to at her as the breezefoot fox got closer, until eventually she flipped the hunu around and wrapped him up in her jacket, muffling his cries, but not entirely. The fox stopped only a few feet away from Strena and began to investigate the same grounds that Guba had been trolling a few minutes before, utterly unafraid. Guba complained louder, until eventually Strena rolled her eyes, squeezed Guba, and tossed the huna on the ground right in front of the fox. The bouncy bird's grew louder as Strena let out a sigh. "Guba, you know Sjelsvint," Strena said, as the fox gave the huna a questioning look and then ignored him, continuing its sweep down the hillside. "See? We see him all the time." Sjelsvint was a name for the breeze that carried the last falling red-orange leaves of the autumn onto the first layer of snow. It was an appropriate name for the breezefoot fox, whose arrival had also signaled to Strena that Nisa would be coming soon. A look over her shoulder again confirmed that the wild woman had arrived, echoing Sjelsvint's arrival as she scanned the land before her, and then gracefully strode down the winding path of greatest ease to meet Strena. Strena was quick to hop up off the bench to greet the wild woman, standing attentively as Nisa approached with the same inquisitive yet elegant grace of Sjelsvint. All of the wild women had a tendency to act like their familiars, or maybe it was that similarity that had drawn them together in the first place. It wasn't clear. Beside her, Guba struggled to his feet and leapt back to Strena's side, waddling to its feet as Nisa approached. "Good morning, child," Nisa said in a voice both melodic and gruff at the same time. "Have you sensed the turning of the seasons?" Want to know what happens next? Join us on Patreon to become a hero of Edera and get early access to episodes along with bonus features, director's commentary, and the full Tab to archive. You can also find other ways to support us at the links in the description, and we will see you next week.